the big problem that we've got that the trade system hasn't really had a lot to say about is climate change, and that's affecting people in more vulnerable countries, countries in Africa. So our partners in Tanzania and Kenya have seen huge floods, whilst partners in Bangladesh are experiencing a heat wave that affects their ability to grow food, their ability to work, and so on. And the trade system hasn't had anything to do with that. It hasn't had any kind of interaction with that. So certainly, and our expectation isn't that trade and free markets should on their own tackle those issues. But if your argument is, well, trade will arrange itself in the fairest possible way, I think it's possible to say that that hasn't happened. The next question is, have they made things worse? So trade wasn't designed to tackle things like employment and climate change. That was never the point of it. It was supposed to just do that economic job of freeing up the market. But it does now have a big impact on things that aren't to do with the market. So, for example, some of the rules within the trade system make it so that countries aren't allowed to direct investments towards the creation of jobs. So, for example, when the UK wanted to ensure that local jobs were created as a result of renewables projects, the EU took a challenge or threatened to challenge the UK under the World Trade Organization, because the World Trade Organization said you're not allowed to do that. They say it's unfair. And so the UK then withdrew and said, okay, we won't try and ensure that investment goes to local jobs. The trade system locks in the privatization of services. So it has an impact on health services, on education, on trains. So if you think that your services aren't being run very well, it's very difficult for you to decide to go renationalize, because the trade system will make sure there's quite a hefty cost to that. And the trade system also introduces a test on just normal regulation. So it asks, has your new set of regulations been more trade distorting than we think is really necessary to achieve what you want to achieve? And that can make it hard to regulate in all kinds of sectors, including things like food. And the final thing that it's worth remembering is the trade system establishes a system where governments and companies can sue other governments, not companies, just governments, if they think that there's been a breach of trade rules. So it means there's a big financial cost to lots of decisions that we might want to make. So particularly around climate change, we see lots of countries being sued, for example, when they want to stop drilling for oil and gas, and it costs them millions, if not billions. There isn't that kind of system doesn't exist for the other things that we might want to promote. So there isn't a similar system for climate change. So if you don't do the things you say you want to do to tackle climate change, there's no way to sue you in the same way. There are measures to enforce human rights, but it's a lot harder and it can take a lot longer. And there's nothing, for example, there's no equivalent to hold companies to account if they don't pay minimum wage, if there's child labour in their supply chains, and so on. So in that sense, there's quite a lot of unfairness built into the system. So the other question that I've been asked to talk about is how trade affects everyday life. And you probably understood from what I've been saying that it affects almost every aspect of everyday life. So it affects what's on our supermarket shelves. That's both in terms of the tariffs that we charge at the border, how much it costs to buy your fruit and vegetables, for example, but also the regulations. So the amount of pesticides that might be on your fruit and vegetables when you buy them. Trade has something to say about that. The kinds of cars you might want to buy, how your energy, rail and health services are delivered, which company runs the trains, which company is running the private clinic, and how moving to low carbon will affect the job market, which is something you might want to think about in your assembly. It's really hard to track how trade is having an impact on these things, and we don't really do it systematically. So we do talk about, is trade contributing to GDP? Is it making us richer? And that's all of us. So we don't know whether it's going to the richest, whether the benefits are going to the richest in society, or the poorest. We don't have a way of breaking that down. You can't really tell. And it's difficult to separate out the causes that might be the effects that might be coming from trade versus effects that might be coming from other things. So you'll all be aware that we've been talking about whether COVID's had an impact on different supply chains, the war, the global economic downturn. It's really difficult to pull out the different impacts. But we haven't really tried to do any of this, so we haven't really spent as much time or energy looking at the social or environmental impacts of trade as we have on the economic impacts of trade. And I think that's because we've tried to think about the trade as the trade system as a completely separate thing, as though it didn't have an impact on all of these other aspects of life, despite the fact that it's got actually quite a lot of obvious impacts.
The UK is an interesting story. Since coming out of Europe, we're pretty much the only major economy now that's sort of going it alone to some degree. Most, if not all, other major economies are part of a bloc, whether it's Europe, whether it's ASEAN, whether it's the Americas, North America, and so on. So that makes the UK quite interesting. Our role in trade is really important and always has been as a pragmatic champion of open cross-border trade. And really the rules for business is very simple. Businesses always thrive where there's minimal bureaucracy, red tape, and complexity. The more, and this is the challenge for the UK, is the more we go it alone, the more complex it becomes. There are already 2,000 to 3,000 trade agreements between countries globally, which is effectively 2,000 to 3,000 different sets of rules. It's a big spaghetti bowl. It's always better to have multilateral agreements, global agreements, one common set of rules that everybody can follow. And of course, that means a lot less bureaucracy. And ultimately, this is all about cost. The more bureaucracy there is, the more complexity there is, the more cost there is. And that cost gets passed straight down to consumers and businesses on the ground. So it's the average person pays in the shops for all this sort of unnecessary complexity and bureaucracy that trade is full of, and increasingly becoming so, I think. So the UK has to play a fine line between aligning to our biggest trade partner, Europe in our case, obviously wanting to position ourselves internationally where the high growth markets are, and what's going on in Asia, for instance. That's the right thing to do. But to balance that with not making it overcomplicated and working as much as possible with our trading partners to keep the rules as aligned as we possibly can. Trade is, without question, being put under terrific pressure. I mean, there was a lot happening before COVID. There's a shift in supply chains, other countries in the emerging markets, particularly in the East, where, incomes have risen over recent decades. Production therefore moves closer to the consumers. So there was a lot of change going on because of demographic change as well. Big youth populations in places like Africa and Asia and the Middle East, driving much of the sort of trading base. And so those change technologies are another big part of this, of course. Terrific advancements in technology over the last decade or so. Then came COVID, which put a lot more pressure into the system, a lot of pressure on supply chains, really exposed the lack of resilience, the antiquated nature of and processes of trade. I think the average person would be gobsmacked if they knew just how much paper and manual activity goes on in trade. It doesn't operate much differently today than it did in the 1800s. In fact, we've just changed the law last year, the Electronic Trade Documents Act. That was an update from the law in 1882, can you believe? It's that sort of antiquated nature. And then, of course, with the growing number of conflicts around the world is a real concern because it really disrupts our supply chains. Whether you're coming through the Red Sea and now having to go all the way around the Horn of Africa, that absolutely will increase costs. So there's a lot of pressure in the system. The growth of nationalistic and populist governments is making it very, very difficult to come to common agreement. Now, I would argue strongly that we need to learn to coexist and not force our values and opinions on others, whether it's coming from China or Europe or the US or anyone else. We've got to learn to coexist in the system, work with each other, because none of us can improve trade or tackle the bigger challenges around climate and environment unless we're all around the table working together with some pragmatism thrown in, because what one country wants to do as a priority isn't necessarily the same for another country. So we have to give and take, which is what trade's all about. It's not about one party dictating to the other party. It's about a common agreement of what's acceptable. But, it's really, really important that we speak up. We're at the table. We're being positive and constructive in the conversations to broker the dialogue. The UK actually now, like Japan and Singapore, Brazil, and other countries, are playing a critical role because there are some fairly significant disagreements between the likes of the US, China, and EU. We need the intermediary economies in countries like the UK to help broker the conversation about what's the right decisions to make, what are the right agreements that work for Africa, they work for Latin America, they work for us, and they work for everybody else. That's our role. We've got a long history of being a broker and a pragmatist, and the world really needs that sort of active champion in the system.